Hello everybody, and as a 24-year-old delayed version of the Y2K bug evidently has not killed us all, welcome to 2025 and Drydock episode 331. This week the questions are taken from Guide 406 to the French early submarine plongeur, the Wednesday video on what happens when a shell hits a battleship, and the Friday video on frigate duels of the War of 1812, what happened to them afterwards, the final fates. So let's get on. Vicky asks, and I'm going to slightly condense this, historically Beatty's turn in succession at the end of the run to the south, combined with Seymour's failure to haul the signal flags back down to actually execute the signal, sends 5th Battle Squadron into the teeth of the High Seas Fleet. However, if the signal had been promptly executed, 5th Battle Squadron would have turned back while north of the surviving battle cruisers, and thus, instead of the German fleet concentrating their fire on the Queen Elizabeths, which are the toughest ships present on the field, they would have instead focused on the Battlecruiser Fleet, which was already quite badly damaged, and potentially also slowed in their retreat by having the Queen Elizabeths ahead of them. Given the amount of damage that the much tougher Queen Elizabeths received during this section of the battle, it's hard to believe that Beatty's remaining ships would have survived if they were the ones being fired upon instead, and with those ships lost at that stage of the battle, they can't then join up to help 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron later on. So all in all, did Beatty and Seymour's poor signalling at the end of the run to the south actually save the Battlecruiser Fleet from destruction? So to examine this, we actually have to look very carefully at the situation. So we're going to use 3 of the German track charts. You can see here, this is the German track chart for the start of the whole manoeuvre, where you have on the left, I've indicated with an arrow, this is the British battlecruisers. On the right, indicated with another arrow, is the leading elements of the German High Seas Fleet. And up to the north you can see the 1st Scouting Group on the top right and the 5th Battle Squadron on the top left, still duking out with the destroyers in the middle. Now, one of the key things to look at here specifically is that although the High Seas Fleet, as you can see from this blue section linking the two, is trying to fire on the British battle cruisers, due to the limitations in how far the German guns can elevate at this stage of the war, this is pretty much the absolute maximum range for their guns, and possibly slightly beyond it, depending on exactly which point you measure to and from. Now, if we move on to the next chart, which actually shows the turnaround of the 5th Battle Squadron down there on the bottom left, which I've indicated with the left-hand arrow, and you can see at this point the High Seas Fleet is kind of dividing up. You've got the German battle cruisers having done their own turnabout up to the top right, and the right-hand red arrow put there is kind of in between the lead German battle divisions. You've got the 5th Division up there just to the top right, so northeast of the arrow put down, so that's led by Koenig, and just directly south of that arrow is 6th Division led by Kaiser, with other divisions coming up behind. Now, the interesting thing to note about this is that if, again, you draw the range lines, and obviously there are various time markers on a total chart, but if you draw the range lines to where everybody is represented as they are at the moment, you can see the British battlecruisers up there on the top left. And even if you walk back those time markers as per the range chart, what you'll find is that 5th Battle Squadron is at long range for what German guns can elevate to, but still within range for pretty much the entirety of the pictured loop that they do, as is drawn here. Whereas the battlecruiser fleet is generally speaking out of range of the High Seas Fleet's guns because they're further to the north, so the fire track is kind of northwest. Now, you do have a line drawn there from Koenig to Lion, but I'm 99% sure that's a sighting line, as if you actually scale all the ranges, that's well beyond Koenig's ability to actually reach Lion. So if you want the full charts, then, well, let me know. I can send them to you, or you can look them up on the Jutland 1916 website. But essentially, the battlecruiser fleet at this point is just about on the edge of the range of First Scouting Group. Again, roughly in a similar situation to 5th Battle Squadron is with the High Seas Fleet, but it is actually drawing away from them and is well outside of the gun range of the High Seas Fleet. And as you'll actually note, as far as the Germans' estimated speed, the Battlecruiser Fleet, partly because of the damage it had already sustained, was going about the same speed as 5th Battle Squadron anyway. So if the turns had been correctly signalled and executed, in actual fact, the High Seas Fleet would have been able to see the British formations, but it's highly unlikely, outside of some very speculative long-distance shots for a few minutes at best, that any of them would actually have been able to engage the Battlecruiser Fleet and 5th Battle Squadron. The 1st Scouting Group still could have done so, but of course if they'd done so, then it would have been a repeat of the run to the south, where you have BT ships and 5th Battle Squadron concentrating their fire on 1st Scouting Group, which we already know is kind of a losing proposition for 1st Scouting Group. You could argue that maybe with the battle cruisers trailing 5th Battle Squadron, Hipper might try and further slow down one of the damaged ships and leave it to be picked off by the High Seas Fleet. But it would be a very bold decision of him to concentrate fire on a damaged battle cruiser when you have 4 Queen Elizabeth class pounding the ever-living daylights out of you, and you don't want to give them a free target practice run. Now, the other interesting thing as we move on to the last chart for this question, I haven't got any particular arrow pointers at this point, but you can see, generally speaking, you've got the elements of the High Seas Fleet down there in the bottom centre, and 5th Battle Squadron where it was historically being engaged. You've got the 1st Scouting Group in basically dead centre, and BT's battle cruisers kind of to the left and fractionally north of them. But the interesting thing, because you mentioned Hood's 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron, is there they are to the top right, just coming to assist. Now, if the 5th Battle Squadron had turned earlier and they were north of BT's ships, they'd probably be maybe just a fraction to the north or northwest of 1st Light Cruiser Squadron, which is the formation that you can see kind of top centre left, where its course is demarcated by almost a 90-degree turn from northwest to northeast. Which actually means that had Beatty and Seymour done their jobs properly, 5th Battle Squadron would actually be closer at this stage to 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron, probably heavily engaging 1st Scouting Group, which therefore would be in a less good position by the time they come across 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron, and therefore actually it probably would have worked out better for 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron. So you can chalk that one up as another one to blame BT for. The man formerly known as Commenting Is What I Do asks, many early submarines are often held back by both technological deficiencies and a lack of knowledge. If given hindsight of what features are required for an actually usable submarine and what ideas are hazardous dead ends, what is the earliest possible year that a proper U-boat-esque submarine could be constructed? Well, a lot of the technologies like hydroplanes, pressure hulls, at least pressure hulls enough to get you deep enough to not be at risk of being sideswiped by every passing ship or go below your crush depth, etc. These kinds of things were possible surprisingly far back into the 19th century. The two bigger problems are your offensive payload, i.e. your torpedoes, and your ability to manoeuvre on the surface and recharge your batteries. So, although the first U-boats, so SMU-1 for example, specifically obviously the Germans, they are actually still kerosene powered, so not diesel powered. But if we take your question to mean a proper U-boat, i.e. a diesel-electric submarine armed with torpedoes capable of reaching out and hitting a target at something other than point-blank range, so we want a minimum engagement range of around 800 to 1,000 yards, then actually you're probably looking at not that much sooner than the emergence of actual U-boat-esque submarines anyway, because the commercial diesel engine only really comes onto the market at the very end of the 1890s, and it's adopted surprisingly quickly, at least in experimental submarines. So this is the French submarine Aigrette, I think. Aigrette, maybe. And it's one of 2 experimental submarines that are put into service at the very beginning of the 1900s, and they are the first diesel-electric submarines in anybody's navy. It actually takes the Germans almost a decade to catch up with the idea, believe it or not. And so the main weakness, as you can probably guess from the scale of the submarine to the men on top, is that it's a fairly small sub. But if you had the advantage of hindsight and you knew that obviously bigger subs are better to a certain degree because you get an increased amount of volume for a relatively minimal increase in overall dimensions, you could have a reasonably sized, therefore reasonably ranged diesel-electric submarine capable of diving to acceptable depths circa 1901, 1902. You'd be using some very early experimental diesels, but at least for European warfare you could make it work. But then you get to the other problem, which is the torpedoes, and unless you want to be creeping up to 300-400 yards away to make sure the torpedo actually has enough juice at the end of its run to hit the target hard enough to detonate, you're again waiting for 1902 to 1904 for the introduction of the first torpedoes with a range that comfortably exceeds 1,000 yards. Now, the reason why I say you want to comfortably exceed, so maybe 1,500 yards, is because you want to shoot inside the range of your torpedoes, just in case you've slightly miscalculated the range, and as I say, you don't want to be, running out of puff in your torpedoes just as they get into contact with the enemy ship, because the performance, especially of early torpedoes, could be mitigated or improved depending on the temperature of the sea and so forth that you're shooting through. So, yeah, if you want a proper diesel-electric submarine capable of engaging its enemies at 800 to 1,000 yards comfortably with torpedoes, even with hindsight, you're pretty much looking at a 1902 at the very, very earliest to get that. If you wanted to accept a petrol or kerosene-powered vessel instead, and or accept that you're going to have to get to potentially worryingly close to within the blast radius of your own torpedoes, then you can wind the clock back surprisingly far. But 1902, I say, would be your threshold for commissioning something that is actually kind of a proper diesel-electric sub. Gord M asks, how did Victorious, Illustrious, etc. endure so many bomb hits and survive, but one bomb hit sank Hiryu? Well, firstly, a quick note, one bomb hit didn't sink Hiryu. Hiryu was hit by multiple bombs. I think you're thinking of a Kagi. She's the only major Japanese aircraft carrier that went down and was only hit by a single bomb, as you can see depicted here. Now, there are essentially three main reasons once you're looking at actual bomb hits as opposed to ability of aircraft and carriers to actually hit each other, because British carriers were quite good at dodging. But nonetheless, assuming we're just looking at hits, the three reasons are, firstly, the British had a somewhat better idea of how to handle aircraft and fuel situations. So if you ended up with a bomb exploding in the hangar, as you did with a Kagi, then it was less likely that that fire would build and spread to the point where it could demolish the entire ship. That's not to say that a bomb hit amongst a bunch of fueled up and armed aircraft in a hangar on a British ship wouldn't do a lot of damage. It would, but the damage control measures that were in place aboard Royal Navy ships were generally better than those on Japanese aircraft carriers. And that factors in everything from, the kind of screens, the kind of fire suppression equipment, how many aircraft you're actually going to have fueled, ready and warmed up within the hangar at any given point, and much like the contrast between Japanese and American crews who exactly can do damage control. The next thing to point out is that the various British carriers were hit by a wide variety of bombs, and some of them were smaller than the 1,000-pounders that the Dauntlesses were lobbing at Akagi. Now, granted, some of them were bigger, but obviously a smaller bomb would cause less damage even if it got down into the hangar deck. A bigger bomb would cause more, but that leads us on to the third point, which is simply the armoured flight decks. Now, obviously, British carriers, their armoured flight decks didn't extend the full length of the carrier from tip of bow to tip of stern. It was an armoured flight deck over the hangar, but as we've established with Akagi and with pretty much every other Japanese carrier, the hangar is the bit that you don't want to be hit. In fact, even with things like Bunker Hill and Franklin as well. Basically, if you get an explosive, whether that be a bomb or an aircraft, in the case of a kamikaze, down into a hangar that's full of fueled and ready aircraft, even if your damage control procedures are great, and even if your fuel lines, etc., are relatively safe, it's still going to cause some very major problems. But this is where having the armoured flight deck comes in handy. Because yes, you could hit outside of that, but you wouldn't get a bomb into the hangar and the mobs of fueled up aircraft there. If you did get a bomb in a place where it would otherwise get into the hangar, if it's a smaller bomb, so a 250, 500 pounder or something like that, which is the kind of bombs, ironically enough, that the Japanese were generally lobbing, that would basically just smash into the armoured flight deck and not do all that much. So you're safe from that. 1,000 pounder, like the Dauntlesses are lobbing, that's a little bit more of an edge case. It would depend very much on what kind of bomb you were dropping and how optimal your drop was. So a general purpose or high explosive 1,000 pounder probably still going to have roughly the similar effect, i.e. not on a huge amount comparatively speaking. An armour piercing 1,000 pounder, and of course there are also semi-armour piercing bombs as well, but let's say an armour piercing 1,000 pounder, the worst case scenario, dropped from a perfect angle and height, might make it through. The armoured flight decks weren't actually technically designed to withstand that kind of impact, but in the Mediterranean it turned out that for various reasons they usually kind of could, or at least mitigate it quite severely. Obviously if you drop something even heavier, you will defeat the armoured flight deck, but then this is the other point, which is that even in the event of a bomb that does partially or fully defeat an armoured flight deck, the fuse will have been initiated. It's possible you might actually have damaged the bomb enough that it won't detonate in a high order detonation. It might break up and you get a low order detonation, which is less dangerous. But even if you do get a surviving bomb that will then detonate properly, if you like, because the fuse will have been initiated smashing into the armour deck, it will then detonate considerably higher up in the ship, whereas even a general purpose bomb, assuming it's got either a slight delay or a tail fuse or something, that goes through a more standard flight deck, and even worse for a semi-armor piercing or armor piercing weapon, not only will go down into the hangar deck, but it'll get quite far down into the hangar deck and possibly even below, which means when it detonates, far more of its force is down at the level where the aircraft are, where the fuel lines are, and potentially sending splinters down into the machinery rooms and so forth, and therefore going to do a lot more damage, whereas a bomb that is slowed and therefore detonates higher will, comparatively speaking, do less damage. So between all of those factors, it'll reject a bomb more often. If it does take a bomb, it's not going to do as much damage because it's going to detonate in a slightly more optimal place. And even if you get such a bomb detonating, damage control procedures are somewhat better. That explains why the British Illustrious class tend to be able to take quite the pounding and still come out of it intact, whereas worst case scenario with the Japanese, like Akagi, you get a single 1,000 pounder and that's it. Although it did take a while for the fires to finally claim her. Niels Larsen asks, why would France accept the Washington Naval Treaty when they had just about as much water to cover as the British in relation to maintaining a presence in their empire, but in terms of tonnage they weren't even allowed to have as many ships, let alone capital ships, as Japan? There was a lot of political haranguing at the negotiations themselves, but the simple fact of the matter is that France was actually flat out broke. Now, you see a lot of stuff talk about who was broke and who wasn't in the aftermath of the First World War. Britain, for example, is often characterised as that. They weren't. They had some harsh financial decisions to make, but the way that Britain chose to make those financial decisions was from a range of options in terms of in a naval building race, etc. They could have afforded it, but they chose that they didn't want to, much the same way as the US could have continued its massive building spree, but the new government in the early 1920s decided they didn't want to. The French, however, were pretty much as close to broke as it's possible for a major power to actually be, and of course had suffered massive casualties in the First World War that they were also recovering from as a nation. And they knew this. So despite some, political flimflammery at the actual treaty negotiations themselves, the French knew it was pretty much pointless to waste a bunch of political capital arguing to have a fleet, let's say, on a par with Japan's or even larger, simply because they couldn't afford to have one. Look at the list of ships they were allowed to retain, and even with the limited tonnage that they were given, 3 of the capital ships they were retaining were Danton-class pre-dreadnoughts. They just physically didn't have enough dreadnoughts to fill even their existing tonnage, and in the space between the end of World War I and the signing of the Washington Treaty, they'd already looked at, could we build new ships? So could we build a Lion class, for example, or could we build a successor to a Lion? And they decided, no, we can't afford that. And then they'd looked at the partly complete Normandies and thought, can we build, or can we at least complete a Normandy or two, perhaps with a few revisions to the design in light of wartime requirements? And they concluded they couldn't even do that. The only thing that came out of the Normandy class program, even though a bunch of the hulls were already part complete, was Béarn being turned into an aircraft carrier, for all the good that that did them. So if they can't even find the funds to complete a ship which they've already paid a good chunk of money for, and therefore there is relatively little left to pay to complete it, then they're not going to even have the money to turn around and say, hey, we want something like the British where we want to build a couple of brand new ships as well, because that's going to involve even more money. And so if your existing fleet allowance, which you can barely afford as is, includes pre-dreadnoughts, why bother arguing for anything more? You'd theoretically, yes, have a bunch more tonnage allocation, but you couldn't fill it with anything. You can't build anything new because you can't afford it, and at best what you could do is maybe retain a couple more Dantons for all the good that's going to do you. And then you've got the additional maintenance cost of a bunch of pre-dreadnoughts in a world where super dreadnoughts and second generation super dreadnoughts are the current thing. And then that economic condition doesn't really improve. So you might argue, well, why don't they, go for something more at, say, the London Treaty? But when you look at that era, well, around the time of the London Treaty, because they had such old ships in their inventory, the Marine National actually had options to begin construction of new capital ships in the late 1920s, as opposed to everybody else, well, potentially except the Italians as well, but the bigger powers had to wait until, theoretically, 1932-33. And not only did the French choose not to exercise those options, but around the time when they should, in theory, have had the capability of retiring some of the Dantons and replacing them with new construction, they instead didn't build anything and put the Dantons and shortly thereafter a good chunk of the Courbets down into training duties rather than frontline battle units, which meant that by the time World War II rolled around, pretty much the only active French battleships were the Britannias, and with some attempts to reactivate the Courbets. Not counting, of course, the fact that had by that point actually built the Dunkirks and were in the process of building the Richelieus, but we're talking about the older stuff. The Mighty Nanto asks, I've read from the damage report of USS North Carolina's torpedo hit from I-19 that the torpedo did actually cause a flash in Turret 1's magazine, and that it could have possibly detonated the magazine if it struck even slightly further aft than it did. Is this actually true, and do you think I-19's torpedo could have done that had it struck slightly further aft? Well, what we definitely know is that, as per the damage control report, it was reported that there was smoke in the magazines, and that was the reason they were flooded in the aftermath, because they thought there might be a fire somewhere. However, if you have a look back at a video I did with a US Rear Admiral who's obviously now working with the USS North Carolina, they've done a lot more analysis of the hit in using modern techniques and so forth. And the overall conclusion they've come to is that it's actually probably more likely that it was the humid air caused by the environment at the time being forced to condensate out by the projected shockwave of the torpedo arriving, mostly because when they've looked at the post-damage incident reports, there doesn't seem to have been anything found within the magazine that was actually ever on fire, which of course would be necessary for something to produce smoke. But of course, given the circumstances, the fact that sailors mistook a whole bunch of wispy white vapor hanging in the air for smoke, when it's probably not going to seem all that different, that's fairly understandable. But with all that said, there's actually a series of extremely high-resolution plates on Naval History and Heritage Command's website which show in detail the exact nature of the damage incurred. So while it's, at least at the moment, appears to be unlikely that there was actual flash in Turret 1's magazine, if the torpedo had struck further forward or further aft, and I would say either forward or aft is a possibility because you've got powder magazines either side, well, fore and aft of the turret, could it have caused a turret fire? Maybe. Now, the reason I say that is because obviously I'm showing you the side-on profile, but if you also look at the top-down profile, what you'll notice is that the barbette of turret 1 actually seems to have at least partially supported the plating that was being shoved in by the tail end of the torpedo's explosion. Whereas if that had happened slightly fore or slightly aft, then you could have ended up with that plating being forced further in, and therefore there being a rupture, therefore the explosion actually getting into the powder magazine. Now, the reason why I would say it may or may not be an issue is because even if a flash did get into the powder magazine, it would still have to get through the containers, so the explosion would have to be powerful enough to distort, buckle, and rip apart the containers for the charges, and then the flash could get to the charges and potentially set them off. So that could maybe happen, but then you might also face the situation that actually saved USS Boise during the Guadalcanal campaign, which is, in her case, a shell hit did actually start a legitimate magazine fire, but the water pouring in through the hole that the shell had created to start that magazine fire put the fire out. So, given that this is a torpedo strike, so causing a much bigger hole, you'd essentially be weighing up how quickly would the fire potentially in the powder room spread, and how fast would that therefore build up into an explosion that could tear the ship apart, versus how quickly can water get in through the hole to put the fires out. In which case you'd probably actually want the maximum devastation possible by the torpedo to open up the largest possible hole, whereas the worst case scenario would be perhaps just a few rents in the final inner bulkhead, which is just enough, perhaps with a bunch of hot spalling as well. So perhaps hot spalling is what punctures the canisters and sets everything on fire, but with only a very few minor leaks, that might give enough time for the fire to spread. But in terms of an overall threat to the ship, I think actually a hit slightly forward of turret 1 would be more dangerous than a hit slightly aft, because, as I said, there's powder magazines either side, but in particular, what you might just about be able to see in this zoom-in section, which is why I've chosen this picture, and if you can't then, well, go to Naval History and Heritage Command and look in and zoom in on the full picture yourself, is that on the left-hand side of the picture, where you can see all the red arrows from the blocks of text on the left pointing for all the various damage, you can see that there's actually two sections where the innermost portion of the hull has deformed, kind of about 2/3 of the way up and about only 20% of the way up. And in between there's this slightly thicker plate. Now, if you check out Norman Friedman's US battleships, you'll find that this is a just over 3-inch thick plate of steel put, as you can see from the top of the 12-inch armour plate to the top right, put in just below the level of the main armour belt, abreast to the magazines, because they discovered at the last minute the same factor affected the North Carolina class as I believe is what killed Hood, namely that the standing waves of the ship's bow wave when it was at speed actually pretty much directly paralleled the magazines, which could lead to a shell ducking under the armour plate and smashing into the magazines unimpeded. And so behind the torpedo protection system, which would obviously slow the shell down a bit, they put a just over 3-inch thick sheet of armour to try and mitigate that risk. That, however, is only over the magazines, and you can see why you don't actually want a thick, rigid bulkhead, which is effectively what that armour is forming, right behind it, because as you can see, the stress from the torpedo builds up either side, and that causes actual deformation and ripping around the relatively still intact piece of armour. And that's the closest you get to getting major flooding. Now, the reason I say a hit further forward might be more dangerous is because a hit somewhat aft between turret 1 and turret 2 is going to have pretty much the same effect as we see here, minus a little bit of the supporting effect from turret 1's barbette. Whereas a hit slightly further forward, some of the blast is going to be just forward of the armour bulkhead, which comprises the ship's citadel. And that means that you're going to get the force of the blast not only essentially coming over and under this 3-inch plate, it's also going to be going around it, thus causing a massive shear point, which could potentially rip open a considerably greater portion of the ship. So not only would you have potentially a turret fire or a magazine fire and an explosion in the powder room, maybe, as we've already discussed, but you'd also have a very major breach of watertight integrity, either just forward or right in the front of the citadel from that shear, which could cause much, much more significant flooding than what we actually saw with the hit, and obviously especially down at the bow, that could seriously endanger the vessel as a whole, in conjunction obviously with potentially a fire in the powder magazine. Not necessarily that having massive flooding in the bow would immediately sink the ship. That would be more if the hit was considerably further aft, adjacent to the machinery, so where a hit potentially would impact partially on the tail end of that 3-inch plate and then the machinery spaces, but more with the fact that if your entire bow is flooded, as you see with Lutzow, the ship might not be negatively buoyant at that point, but if the bow goes down far enough, the stern comes up high enough and the propellers come out of the water, and then you're pretty much dead in the water, quite literally, even if you aren't technically negatively buoyant at that stage. Warrant Officer Will asks, "It is often said that a country has to choose between having a strong army or a strong navy, with Russia and Germany being examples of countries that sacrifice their naval arms. However, France, during most of the period the Channel covers, seems to have been an exception to the rule. Even if they never surpassed Britain, they still managed to be a significant naval power while never sacrificing anything of their army. How was France able to do this? Essentially by just being absolutely colossal compared to everybody else in overall economic terms. Now, what I mean by that is that if you look at a chart of UK versus French GDP or GDP per capita, etc., particularly per capita GDP, from about 1650, 1700s onwards, and there is actually a whole paper looking at this, believe it or not, which is actually quite interesting to read. Although the UK generally stays ahead of France in terms of GDP per capita, i.e. how much money they have per head of population, which is obviously an indicator not just of individual wealth, but national wealth, the UK stays ahead in GDP per capita by about 15 to 20%. But consumption per capita in France is lower than in Britain. And even if you take the population of the UK as a whole post-Active Union, as opposed to just the population of England, the French population is 3 to 4 times greater than the UK's population between roughly 1700 and 1800, 1850 or so. And this means that even if you're only producing, let's say, 80% per capita in terms of money, if your population is 3 or 4 times higher, that means you still actually have colossally more money than the UK does. And if you have a very large population base, a lot of money as a result, and therefore also, and because we said consumption, your individual consumption per population head is relatively speaking low, you can actually afford to field a very large army, and you will still have the money left to be able to build a very large navy. Now, as a proportion of your overall GDP, your navy will not cost you as much as Britain building a slightly bigger navy will. However, Britain isn't paying for a colossal army, therefore it can devote most of the money that would otherwise be spent on the army to the navy, so it can actually afford a larger navy proportionally than the French can. But in absolute terms, the numbers can be pretty close. So using arbitrary numbers, but will have some resemblance to reality, if we say that, for ease of argument, the French have 3 times the GDP that the UK does, and the French decide to spend 9% of their GDP on their military. Now, back then it would have been considerably higher, but we'll just take that as read for the minute. And they spend 6% on the army and 3% on the navy. If Britain also spends 9% of its GDP on its military, but it spends 8% of that on the navy and 1% on the army, then it's actually spending only slightly less on its navy than France is, and therefore the navies will be approximately equally matched, assuming that the British generally are running with slightly smaller ships, which they historically are. Then they probably have about as many, if not slightly more, than the French, but the French will be slightly more top-heavy, which actually is a fairly good reflection of what historically was the case in most of the 1700s. And because Italy doesn't exist, Germany doesn't exist, because they're both collections of nation-states or city-states, then the only people you really have to worry about are the Spanish, who by the 1700s are powerful but somewhat in decline, and their population levels aren't as high as France, or the weird mix that is the Holy Roman Empire, which includes obviously places like Austria, and the non-Holy Roman Empire bits like Prussia and Russia and so forth, but they're further east and they're doing their own thing. But also in general, their population levels as individual nations are not as high as France. And the interesting thing, of course, is where you start to see the French beginning to lose ground to the British is once the British, A, have properly established their empire in the latter part of the 1700s, and then through the late 1700s, then into the 1800s, the 19th century, as Britain starts to pull well ahead, the more and more Britain industrializes and the more Britain exploits the resources available in its various colonies, and therefore has not necessarily more manpower, although obviously they have access to a bit more manpower, but more especially has access to considerably more money than they would as just the UK. Now, not only is their GDP per capita higher, but their overall GDP is also higher, and thus the British economic advantage grows to a point where you get the outpacing of the Marine Nationale in the middle of the 19th century. So essentially it was a combination of spending priorities coupled with ridiculous overall economic size. And to give you a modern day example, potential example I should say, albeit not one that gives the smaller nation a superiority, if you compare, let's say, the US and UK defence budgets, the US spends ridiculously more than the UK does because the US has a ridiculously larger economy, amongst other things. They also spend slightly more as a percentage of GDP. But if you look at the US Navy budget for the last financial year, it's roughly equivalent to about £190 billion. Now, the UK total defence budget for the last similar financial year is about £53 billion. But those of you who are quick off the mark with some mathematics would work out, therefore, that obviously Britain tries to maintain a navy, an army, and an air force, and therefore that's why the Royal Navy is so much smaller than the US Navy. But in theory, if Britain decided that, and obviously this would be a fairly unwise decision because you need air cover, but if Britain decided that it was just going to have the army as a ceremonial unit, the air force as a ceremonial unit, so essentially restricting the army and air force to the Red Arrows, the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight, and the Guards for Buckingham Palace, and had scrapped everything else and put everything else into the Navy, then in theory, Britain could run a Navy that would be about 1/3 the capability of the US Navy, which would equate to 3 or 4 full-size supercarriers, about 35 to 40 major surface combatants, destroyers and frigates, and somewhere between 14 to 18 nuclear attack submarines, etc., etc. But, you know, this is kind of an example of budget priorities. A smaller nation can sustain a larger navy if they emphasize spending towards that navy at the expense of other services, and that's essentially what Britain was doing in the 17th century to keep pace or exceed the French. Ricardo Wolski asks, relating to the shell and armour penetration video, why is there no high-speed footage of these tests? All I've seen are after-the-fact stills. High-speed cameras were developed well before the 1930s, and there is high-speed footage of the Manhattan Project explosive lens development. Essentially because although the technology existed to take high-speed photography, it didn't exist to take high-speed photography safely in the terms of battleship tests. So, one, you can't necessarily guarantee that the shell is going to hit exactly where you want it to. Two, assuming that you're using a live shell, or at least a shell that is, even if inert, still got significant armor penetration capabilities, when that shell hits, there's either going to be an explosion on the outside as the charge goes off, or there's going to be an explosion inside when the charge goes off, or if the shell doesn't detonate, there's still going to be an explosion of sorts. It's just not going to be the explosive charge aboard the shell. It's going to be a whole bunch of displaced, hot, flying splinters of steel, and so on and so forth. And that means that if you are trying to operate a high-speed camera nearby, then either the shockwave or the splinters or the explosion is either going to kill or incapacitate anyone trying to operate it, or if you somehow manage to jury-rig up something that allows you to operate it remotely, given that we're talking about a lot of stuff in the 1910s and 20s and not so much the 40s, you still have the problem of the shockwave and the splinters and potentially explosion also destroying your incredibly expensive high-speed camera, which is going to have to be relatively close to the action to record anything of any particular value. Because, yeah, you could in theory do the whole thing in slow motion from, a nearby boat, but given the amount of light that you need for high-speed photography to work, you wouldn't really get all that much. You'd either have to zoom so far out to gather enough light that if you were lucky, you might catch a few small details of a small dark object impacting, and that's about it. It wouldn't really tell you much. Or you zoom in with a bunch of lenses to try and get a close-up, but from far enough away that your camera and operator isn't going to be immediately destroyed, and you'll just end up with a bunch of very dark footage that probably doesn't show anything, or if it shows anything at all, it might show the flare of the explosion, but nothing else surrounding it. And so that's basically why high-speed photography of these tests essentially doesn't exist. Even by the time of the Manhattan Project, A, technology has advanced considerably further, and B, you can set up the cameras considerably far away from a full-scale nuclear test, wherein you're less likely to have the camera physically destroyed near enough instantly by debris from the explosions. Brian Smith asks, if Halsey had been healthy enough for Midway, or had taken part in any of the other carrier battles during 1942, do you think he would have charged off as he did at Leyte Gulf to go after the Northern force? I think he definitely still would have gone after Ozawa's force. I mean, he's still a very aggressive admiral, and ultimately an enemy group of carriers is an enemy group of carriers. And while objectively we know exactly how bad a state the Japanese carrier Air Arm was at the time, he's not necessarily going to know that, or even if he has some indication that the Japanese Air Arm is on the back foot, he might not necessarily fully trust that. But whatever the case, he's got to deal with it in some way, shape or form. So some, at least, of Third Fleet is going to head north. As to whether it would be all of them, and whether he would have left Task Force 34 back at San Bernardino Strait, that, I think, would be the thing that could potentially have changed. Because the play of events essentially seems to be, as I've mentioned in a previous Drydock, that once you got to the end of Sibian Sea and Kurita conducting a withdrawal, Halsey essentially, in kind of a case of wish fulfillment, I think, took the initial reports of the pilots at their word. So, slightly over-egging the damage done. Okay, that's neither here nor there. But then just concluding, because we've seen Kurita's force withdraw west, therefore they must be running away, which goes almost contrary to almost every other major engagement. So that's why I think it verges more into wish fulfillment than, actual facts. If Halsey had already had his carrier battle, and therefore he doesn't, in his mind, need a carrier battle to put him on the same level as Spruance or Fletcher or any of the other involved admirals, then he would probably be a little bit more cautious and maybe set out initially with the carriers, because after all, he can, even if he leaves Task Force 34 there and then concludes he doesn't need them, he could leave them there and then order them to catch up at full speed, because the carriers aren't proceeding north at 32 knots. And he could also send out further recon flights or request recon flights, because there are other aerial assets available. There are obviously submarines that were tracking in the area, and he might be able to ask them for reports. There are all sorts of things he could and arguably should have done to actually verify that Kurita was running away rather than turning about. And there was enough daylight hours left for further recon to discover that Kurita wasn't, in fact, just running away, and that he had actually turned around and was heading back in the direction of the San Bernardino Strait. I think particularly if he'd been there for the Battle of Santa Cruz Islands, because obviously at Santa Cruz Islands you had a Japanese surface force which rushed on ahead despite essentially what was going on in terms of the carrier battle, and its approach was in large part what forced the abandonment of USS Hornet CV-8 at the end of the day. So if Halsey had been present for that and been forced to abandon Hornet specifically because of the threat of incoming Japanese surface units which are operating separate from their carrier groups, as opposed to perhaps just having read about it in the abstract, I think then he might have been a lot more suspicious about the strength of Japanese surface forces and whether or not they would actually just run away like that. And at that point, as I said, he might still, in fact, it would be wise of him still to send forces north to deal with Ozawa, but perhaps, as well as Task Force 34, perhaps leave a carrier task force there, or even at least a large carrier or a couple of the independencies, even if perhaps not an entire task force, but certainly leave something just in case. Nathaprong Hongsheron asks, how good were Yamato's torpedo defense systems, and how do you quantify their capability? The only thing that made Yamato so much heavier than the number 13 class seems to be the beam hull width, but the diagrams I can find seem to suggest the volume of torpedo defense systems in Yamato wasn't any bigger than in other fast battleships. So why didn't they just build an improved number 13 instead? There are a few good reasons for not building an improved number 13, some of which is that Yamato's torpedo defense system is still quite substantial. Part of the problem is that everything by this stage is a compromise. It's always been a compromise to a certain degree, but especially by this point. So you can see here from this sort of a midships cross-section of Yamato, or Musashi, I suppose, depending which you want to go with, the armour is sloped, the armour is inclined. Now this is obviously good against incoming shell fire, but it does have a drawback of it cuts through the area that you would otherwise want to fill with torpedo defense systems. Additional to that, Yamato's armour belt, both in terms of the face hardened plate and then the thinner plate below, which you can see illustrated there, goes considerably deeper than you might see on something like a number 13, or quite a lot of other ships, in fact. And that's because obviously the Japanese in the interwar period have come across and invented to a certain degree diving shells. They've implemented them for their own ships, but they've also tried to protect against them in their own designs, which is logical, which means that the armour system is even more cutting into the volume that you would, in most other ships, have filled with a torpedo defence system. And because of this angle, you get a torpedo defence system that, just below the waterline where the bulge starts, is not that wide, compared to other battleships of the period. It's okay, but compared for a ship of her size, it's perhaps not so wide. But as you can see, as that sloped armour continues to slope inwards and the torpedo defence system descends almost but not quite vertically, the torpedo defense system gets wider and wider and wider the further and further down you go, which actually makes sense because torpedoes run at a given depth, and also obviously the water pressure is greater the further down you go. So right down in the lower sections, Yamato's torpedo defense system is very wide compared to almost all other period battleships. And certainly compared to a number 13, which, although it did have some torpedo defense systems built into its design, they're not as substantial as you would get in the mid-1930s and later battleship designs. Another issue is that the number 13, while it has a fair number of secondary guns in casemates, doesn't have anywhere near the overall number of secondary guns once you include the 5-inch anti-aircraft as well as the 6-inch anti-surface that the Yamato originally comes with. And of course, all of the Yamato designs secondary, whether they be anti-ship or anti-air, are all considerably higher, which has a greater effect on stability, which requires more beam compared to a number 13. So there's quite a few good reasons to go with a more up-to-date design. In terms of Yamato's actual torpedo defense system, quantifying its capability is a little bit difficult. There are flaws in it. This isn't necessarily you don't have the time in the Drydock question to go over every detail about Yamato's torpedo defense system, but there are known flaws with the fact it's got a fairly rigid backing plate due to the armour system extending further down when eventually turning into a torpedo defence bulkhead. And as I mentioned, that has problems in terms of concentrating stress, because where you have a rigid backing to a torpedo defence system, the shock just tends to go and find a weak spot, whether that be a weak spot joining two sets of armour together, or a weak spot where the rigid plate stops and a softer, more flexible plate begins, or whatever you want to look at. And of course, you also have the fact that in the Yamatos, you have pure void systems with a rigid backing, rather than void, liquid, void, which in various combinations is usually what you would find in most other ships. And again, there are pluses and minuses to that kind of decision. Not having a liquid layer, but instead relying on just a solid backing plate, aside from the issues mentioned with that previously, means that you do have more options when it comes to counter flooding. And if you conceal the damage, or at least contain it, you have a better options for retaining buoyancy in terms of pumping water out. Because if you don't have any existing liquid-filled areas, then the effect of counter flooding to stabilize your ship is going to be greater. And as I said, if you can contain the area of actual flooding and then pump out the rest of the area, again, if you don't have a substantial area that's already full of liquid, you are going to get proportionally, for a given volume of torpedo defense system, more buoyancy back. But at the same time, there is potential, apart from the issues already mentioned, for the damage to be more extensive in the first place, which, depending on exactly where you're hit and how heavily you're hit, may or may not negate the advantages that you've gained by having a pure void system. Ultimately, of course, both Musashi and Yamato took a lot of torpedoes to put down, so their torpedo defense system, while flawed, wasn't entirely useless. But then, of course, you get into the arguments, as you would get into with a lot of ships that were hit by torpedoes, especially battleships or capital ships generally, of, okay, yes, they were hit by this many torpedoes, but at what point were the hits fatal, and were what... And then all subsequent hits, therefore, would have just been rearranging debris or just sealing the fate of that particular vessel. And that's an argument that can go on for ages and ages. Smelly Kaka asks, if one looks up HMS Caroline, one of the facts that may stand out is that she is the last survivor of the Battle of Jutland. Are there any other notable battles from which exactly one ship survives? What's the oldest battle from which any ship survives in decent condition? Well, with the exception of World War II, in which case, largely thanks to the vast prevalence of US museum ships, there's a good number of battles wherein multiple ships present are still around as museum ships. Once you go beyond that, almost every museum ship that's older than World War II is probably the sole survivor of a number of battles that it was in. And due to how museum ships usually end up being selected for that duty, there's usually at least one notable battle for which that ship is obviously therefore going to be the only survivor. So, the Battle of Manila Bay, for example, that's going to be USS Olympia is the only survivor of that. Trafalgar, of course, HMS Victory, and even some World War II battles have only one survivor left. So, for example, the Battle of the North Cape, HMS Belfast, is the only survivor of that. USS Constitution is, of course, the only survivor of the frigate duels of the War of 1812, although, obviously, on a more global scale, perhaps the individual duels are not as notable as they would be in, well, either the British or American naval circles, and obviously American naval circles in particular, but for Americans, those battles are very important. But then you come across, what do you count as a ship in decent condition? Because Mary Rose, for example, was involved in a couple of notable battles, but given that she's more than halfway vanished, you've got a portion of one side of the hull left, you can't really necessarily say she's survived in decent condition, although what's left is in decent condition. So I think if you're going to go with, this is a warship, this is substantially all there, and has a continuous history of being mostly substantially all there, and has partaken verifiably in at least one notable engagement, then it's probably actually Victory, at which point her first major engagement was the First Battle of Ushant in 1778. So that would be the oldest battle for which we have a ship in decent condition, where we can actually verify, yes, that ship was absolutely there. If you want to go back further, you then have to rely on wrecks, which have been recovered or salvaged, and therefore, aren't substantially all there. And also, you as you go further and further back past something like Mary Rose, you would begin to get into areas of, well, this ship is from the right period, and potentially might have taken part in this or that battle, but we wouldn't necessarily be able to prove it. Or if you really want to get hyper-technical, abandoning decent condition entirely, we have rams from the Punic Wars. So we can say this ram was at this battle because that's where the ram was found. The rest of the ship is gone, but we know that this ram was at one point just under the water attached to a ship that was taking part in that particular fight. Nosdormu89 asks, it seems to me that post-World War I, German ships were specifically designed with commerce raiding in mind. My question is, did any other power, major or otherwise, specialise their designs for a certain strategy, like the Germans did, or is Germany unique in this regard? Pretty much every navy does have certain specialisations in their designs that are predicated around a given strategy. It's just that most of the time, those strategies involve specific ways of fighting major battles rather than the fairly obvious commerce raiding aim of a lot of the interwar German naval procurement. Although, obviously, towards the end of that, they were looking more and more towards conventional surface actions, at least with someone like France. So, for example, just looking at the interwar period, the Japanese Navy pretty much in almost every one of their dreadnought designs, bar maybe the Kawachis, was looking at having to fight outnumbered. So to a certain degree the Kongos, but certainly the Fusas, the Iseis, the Nagatos, and the Yamatos all have very specific design features built around the strategy of having to fight a larger number of enemy ships. American ships in the interwar period, certainly at the upper end of things, capital ships and large cruisers, are designed primarily around the idea of extremely long-distance combat in two senses, both in terms of how far they're expecting to fling shells at the opponent, and also how far they're supposed to be operating from their home bases. So there's an awful lot of design features and perhaps even design compromises in American ships of that time period, designed to maximize the amount of fuel that you could carry and maximize the range at which you undertook an engagement. While on the flip side, the British are designing their ships more for close-in brawls, almost Nelsonian-style melees. And again, that reflects in their decisions about lots of things. guns, armour, layout of that armour, etc., etc. And finally, for this week, Reva's Rambling Recess asks, I recently read an article on the comparative size of the Bismarck's turrets, not being so much because of the sliding breech block mechanisms, but because of the extensive redundancy that was built into them, backup gun rams, ammunition feeds, etc., etc., and claims that similar overbuilding of systems such as pump capacity and electrical capacity to accommodate failures being a significant contribution to the ship's comparative inefficiency in design. Not necessarily poorly built, but just needlessly overbuilt, as it were. Could you comment on this, given your comments on Bismarck's inefficiency of design in the past? Is it accurate, and if not, what else was the relatively superfluous tonnage being used on? I think I know the one you're talking about because I've read it as well recently, and honestly, I think I have to disagree to a certain extent with the points that they put forward. I wouldn't necessarily say completely disagree, but fairly strongly disagree. With regards to the breech blocks themselves, I think they over-focus on the breech block in and of itself, claiming that it doesn't take up too much space. Well, yes, it kind of does. Admittedly, the breech block doesn't extend massively far, but it does, because it comes out of the side of the gun, it does have an impact on what you can put adjacent to the gun. So this is a zoom in on overhead of Bismarck's turret, or one of them obviously, but if you look at the layout of various other turrets, Iowa class, various British ones, Yamato, etc., and you look next to the breech of the gun, you'll notice that in pretty much every single case, there are facilities or technology that is used to either supply, maintain, or otherwise service the gun and the turret, which is placed adjacent to the breech. And if you look here, you'll notice that immediately adjacent to the breech on either side of Bismarck's guns, there is nothing but essentially a void space, which allows people to pass forward to the seated positions you can see in the cheeks of the turrets there. And so this equipment needs to go elsewhere, which means that you have to find more space somewhere in the turret, which means you have to increase the size of the turret. And that applies equally actually on both sides of the guns. As I said, if you look on the layouts of the various other turrets I mentioned and look at just how close various ancillary equipment is along either side of their guns compared to the fairly large dead spaces either side of the Bismarck's guns, you get some idea of the impact. Plus, there is the greater knock-on effect of having sliding breech blocks, apart from where they are and what effects they might have extremely locally next to themselves. You have the fact that a sliding breech block requires a brass cartridge for the final charge, and if you're going to have the brass cartridge for your final charge, that means you also need a way of getting rid of said brass cartridge, an ejection system essentially, and that ejection system takes up a fair bit of space. So if you're looking at this picture, if you look at the top right and bottom right, those very large structures that go right to the back of the turret and then run forward to either side of the turret, and then after a short break there's what looks like a 55-gallon drum with a chamfer taken out of it. All of that is just to dispose of the empty brass cases, and that is a direct result of using a sliding breech block. If you use an interrupted screw breech block, you don't need any of that. And, that's actually a disturbingly large proportion of the overall floor space of the turret. As for the other stuff, the auxiliary equipment, again, I'm not necessarily buying it. Yes, the Germans were probably the most thorough when it came to having backups of everything, but auxiliary shell hoists, auxiliary charge hoists, they're not unique to German ships. A number of other World War II era ships have them. It's not universal, to be sure, but the Yamato class, for example, has auxiliary shell hoist systems, and they're not exactly new either. The vast majority of British warships at Jutland, 12-inch, 13.5-inch, whatever, they also all had auxiliary shell and charge hoist systems, and they didn't end up having turrets that you could probably sell as $2 million condos on the New York real estate market if you happen to strip out the interior and put them up as residential. And I would argue that most of the other arguments also fall down when you actually compare them to other ships. Now, to be fair, there are ships with considerably less backup electrical generating capacity than Bismarck, particularly British ships. But then on the other hand, if you look at Bismarck needing 4,000 kilowatts to start with, that in and of itself actually screams of horrendous inefficiency, because British ships, although, again, not having a huge margin of power generation aboard as backup, on the King George V class, for example, they're able to run all the electrical systems on the ship and still have some backup in reserve on 3,000 kilowatts. So the fact that Bismarck's carrying almost 8,000 kilowatts, which is around about double of what they need to actually power the ship, one, it reflects the fact the Germans are probably using far too much electrical power to begin with, and two, in her tonnage class, again, it's not that impressive because the Littorios generate almost as much power as the Bismarcks, and although they are over the treaty limits, as I've pointed out before, the Littorios are in many ways, shapes and forms actually far more efficient designs than the Bismarcks are. And the Iowas, which, at least in their original flavour form, are only fractionally heavier than the Bismarcks, especially Tirpitz, generate a mighty 10,500 kilowatts, again without being horrendously inefficiently designed. So, that's another 2,500 plus kilowatts of generating capacity on a ship that has a better armour scheme, better armour layout, is faster, has more guns, heavier guns, better anti-aircraft suite, etc., etc., etc. Likewise, fire control. The idea of redundant and backup fire control systems, not unique to Bismarck. Pretty much everybody has those because everybody realises it's a really bad idea to just have one primary rangefinder or one director, etc. And when it comes to things like pumping capacity, yes, Bismarck's pumping capacity is towards the upper end of things as far as capital ships go, albeit that hard data on exactly what pumping capacity various ships had, especially for World War II ships, is a little bit patchy. But she's not uniquely above and beyond everybody else. I mean, Vanguard, which is a very close match for Bismarck in terms of, overall size, speed. They've even got not exactly the same arm, but roughly similar armament in terms of both having 8 15-inch guns in 4 twin turrets, etc., etc. Vanguard's pumping capacity is very, very close to Bismarck's, and again manages to pull off without being horrendously over-engineered and inefficient, because Vanguard, again, speed, main gun firepower-wise, and overall size-wise, displacement-wise, is very close to Bismarck, but Vanguard manages to pull off having an actual dual-purpose main battery, a superior general anti-aircraft battery, superior fire control systems, thicker belt armour, thicker deck armour, arguably considerably better armour layout. Now, fair enough, her fire control is undoubtedly superior, but that's because when she's finally launched commissions, she is a much later ship, but she has the capacity to carry considerably more radar, etc. up high than Bismarck does without affecting stability. And the main reason I'm sticking to those broader term issues, rather than saying, oh yeah, well, she can shoot more accurately than Bismarck, is because, as I said, yeah, ultimately she is a later ship, so that should be expected. But you've got to remember that Vanguard's initial design, which is where the amount of weight dedicated to armour, the torpedo protection system, the main armament, etc., all of that is decided, is actually not exactly contemporaneous with Bismarck, but very close to contemporaneous with Bismarck. And again, she manages to have a lot of the systems either at or very nearly at the same capacities as Bismarck's supposedly massively overbuilt systems, but still turn out an overall superior product, just from pure engineering terms. So yes, in many ways Bismarck does have a lot of backups, but they aren't unique to her. Many other ships, both from World War II and in fact from World War I, have similar systems, often of, or at least sometimes of, similar capacity. and they manage to deliver either a more efficient design in terms of overall firepower per ton, if you're looking at a smaller or larger vessel and trying to scale it to Bismarck, or in the case of a few ships that are relatively close to Bismarck displacement-wise, like Vanguard or Littorio, or at a small stretch in Iowa, they deliver an overall better product while still having a lot of those redundancies built in. And that brings us to the end of this week's Dry Dock. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening. Hope you're enjoying yourself in this first Dry Dock of 2025 and in 2025 in general. And, well, we'll see you in another video some point soon. Thank you very much. Bye for now.